terms of employee skills, as I already mentioned, this idea of upskilling and how important it is. A master's degree today is what yesterday's bachelor's degree was, and high school degrees aren't even considered relevant. And if you don't have a high school degree, good luck. Finding work is almost impossible. But we still, believe it or not, have shortages of highly skilled workers. We've got a lot of people in that mid-range, but some of our highly skilled workers, we're importing them from other countries. We need more people interested in going into STEM who can do that work. We're seeing some emphasis with companies who really care about human resource management and more emphasis on training. They're doing not only company-specific training, which one would expect under economic theory, but they're also doing general training, making sure people in the company all speak English as a second language, that they're competent in that area, that they're literate, they can read and write, and do some basic math. So there's a lot of companies that invest in, particularly if they're hiring people who are laborers, right? They want to invest in making sure everybody speaks the same language, and has some basic skills. So they will invest in literacy and ESL training for employees. But it's not just that. I mean, they're also doing computer training and sales training and all sorts of different training. The challenge that we have around the area of training and development is when economic times get tough. That's when we need more training. That's when people are expected to do more with less, which is kind of a ridiculous statement, but nonetheless, that's what it is. So if you expect people to do more with less, you've also got to provide the resources and the support for them to be able to do that. So when you cut those resources back, they're not able to fulfill that demand. They can't do more with less because they don't have the tools. They haven't learned the tools to use to do that. They don't know the skills that they need to take on an extra job that they never had to do before. So this becomes a concern. And more companies, particularly those that are smart about wanting to invest in human resource management and their human capital, are doing much more active, proactive development of their workers. That's not to say that all of them are doing that, and it's not to say that it absolves the employee from taking their own career development into their own hands, because it doesn't. But there are those companies that care about human resource management really are doing a good job of helping develop their workers in that arena. In terms of issues of safety and security, we have to deal with concerns about acts of God or terrorism or earthquakes and tsunamis and things like that. These are much more prevalent. I mean, this comes around with global weather changes and climate change. I mean, it's changing. Some places that have been cold are now warm, and some places that were warm are now cold. I mean, it's really shifting. And so because of these shifts, whatever your reason is for why you think it happens, obviously some groups think it's, people are contributed to it, other people don't. Regardless of your opinion, it's still changing. So we are more likely to see more earthquakes, more hurricanes, more tornadoes. We're seeing them in different ways and different times than we typically saw them when it came to our season. They're becoming much more frequent out of season. We've got issues of terrorism and bioterrorism, people putting anthrax in envelopes and poisons in all sorts of stuff. So the amount of violence that we see, you always are hearing about shootings that are occurring. This level of violence hasn't stopped, and but it says the violence has stayed the same. There's some research that's been done that shows that some of the gun violence has definitely increased, and increased in people's workplaces. So, we can get into a huge debate on this, but the bottom line is we are much more focused on keeping our workers safe and keeping our employees safe. This was less of a concern before 9/11 and became much more of an issue after 9/11, where we needed to keep track of people, and we need to make sure that we had systems in place to help people when terrorism and acts of violence or God, came into play. Along with those issues of safety and security, again, partly because of the whole issue with 9/11, is how do we deal with record storage and record safety? Where do we put our records? A lot of the people at the World Trade Center had their storage in their basement. Duh. When the buildings collapsed, all their records disappeared. So we need to have them off-site. Can we do that to make sure that they're in a secure place so that they are going to be protected so someone can't come in and steal our things? Again, the idea of protecting our intellectual property. I've already talked about non-compete and non-disclosure agreements under another heading. It's the same sort of idea. Our intellectual property is going to get hacked pretty regularly. Our identities are being hacked. We need to keep our employees and our customers, their identities and their safety issue, their personal effects safe. That's our job. And then we have the impact of Homeland Security on hiring and people, the intellectual property and human resources that we can use. We want to be able to hire people, but a lot of times we're constrained because of where they may come from or what their religious beliefs are, and they have to jump through so many more hoops in order to be able to do that. I used to work for a Lebanese bank that hired a lot of Lebanese nationals and Lebanese Americans, and today I can't even imagine what it would be like to do HR for that company because the requirements to do background screenings and things like that to get people visas is much more challenging. It was less of an issue and a concern for us when we were doing it in the 80s. A bigger problem nowadays in terms of getting people visas to do work. Then we have this issue of how jobs and work is changing. Work is the effort that we put into accomplishing or producing some sort of results. The job is all the tasks and the duties and responsibilities we have. So I can work every day as part of my job, if you can think about it that way. Work is the things that I do to get the outcomes that I want, and the job is all the things that I am responsible for. It's sort of the larger job description, if you will. And the work is the individual things that I need to do that. And so the nature of work and how we do work, the nature of jobs and how we do our jobs is really changing quite rapidly. Now, here's an example of how work has changed because scheduling has changed. We see lots of differences in the way work was scheduled years ago compared to the way it is now. We see much more flexible scheduling, job sharing, global workforce schedule challenges, because we're trying to deal with a global economy and global businesses. So, I work at night, you work in the morning. Can we get some overlap so we can talk to each other? Having different scheduling alternatives. Can I work 5 days a week, or can I work 4 days a week with 1 day off, or can I have half days here, or can I have Friday afternoon off? So we start thinking about different scheduling alternatives. Do we work 3 shifts, 5 shifts, 4 shifts? What do we need in order to be able to make these things work? So scheduling work is different. And as we talk a little bit about this thing called a results-only workforce, this results-only workforce focuses just on the outcomes. So meetings are optional, and people just have to get their job done, whatever it takes, and they do the work that is assigned to them in whatever way their best means necessary to do it, obviously within the boundaries of ethics and the law, but nonetheless, this is loose scheduling at its best, at its pinnacle, right? Just get your work done, whatever it takes. And so there are some advantages to that, and there are some disadvantages to that, and we'll talk about that in class. This slide gets at some of the things that will affect virtual teams, because that's, again, as we know, is a growing trend, A, because of technology, B, because we have a global economy, so a lot more teams function in a global context. And so what we might see is people working in different geographic locations working on the same project. So the workload has to be managed. So if we are working around the globe, around the clock, I work on a project and I pass it off to the person in the next time zone and the next shift, and then they work on the next shift. So it becomes sort of this rotating responsibility for something. And while that was easy to see when we were manufacturing a product, right, now that we're in the information arena, or we're in the knowledge arena, we haven't really thought about that. And sort of how do we manage, this sort of, this process, So virtual teams are one of the ways that we can do this, where we have people working virtually. They use technology to communicate, to train, to get all the resources that they need. They coordinate everything through the virtual management, and you can get technology, programs, project management software that helps you to manage that. So everybody has access to it, everybody knows what they need to do, what needs to be done when, where they're at in the timeline, et cetera, et cetera. It's fascinating. Managing virtual teams, though, is not an easy thing, and we'll talk a little bit about sort of some of the challenges of that in class, particularly as we start thinking about what we want to do for your final project in the class. Telework is growing, obviously, as we have more technology. It enables us to work at home rather than necessarily working as a virtual team. I might just work at home because it gives me more flexibility in my schedule and things like that. So I use technology, telecommunications to work from any location. The advantage of this is that, of course, I can manage my time better and I can schedule things when it works best for me. It becomes challenging for us then to figure out how we're going to evaluate people. It used to be that someone would come in, I would watch their work output, and I would watch their work process, and I could evaluate them. Now I'm really only evaluating them on results. That's a big difference and a big different approach. So it affects how we as managers need to think about how do we evaluate people and go from there. We need more trust, more cooperation, more communication. It's less command and control and much more about, here's your training, here's your guidelines, I'm here to answer questions, but I'm empowering you. I'm giving you autonomy to go to town and do the work that you need to do. Some workers are really good at that. Other workers are not. They don't know how to manage their time as well, and they don't know how to manage their priorities as well. And so not everybody is going to be a good teleworker. We obviously have to think about legal issues in terms of liability. Do you have a dedicated workplace? What if somebody slips and falls as they walk into your office? Who's liable? There are some concerns around that, but generally speaking, they're easy to get around. We just have to make sure that we address them as we're thinking about doing telework. And then lastly, if you're not visible, do people think you're busy? Do people think you're serious? Do you need FaceTime in order to be thought of as a good worker? And there are some companies, there's some academic environments that, if you're not in your office, if you're not giving FaceTime, this is a concern. And so we need to be thinking about how are we evaluating people for advancement and for promotion. And there's been some research out there that said, women who took maternity leave, even if their 6 months of their year was spent face-to-face in the company, but 6 months might have been out on maternity leave or what have you, because they don't have a full year of work, they're evaluated as lower performers than someone who was there for the full 12 months. Well, they took advantage of a benefit that the company gave them, and why should they be penalized? If they performed well for that 6 months, that's the 6 months they're evaluated on, and they should be evaluated in the same way as anybody who had to take time off for an illness or, maternity leave or you name it. Why should that person be have less opportunities for advancement simply because they took advantage of a company benefit? That's a cultural issue, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. There are cultural issues where companies can have all sorts of wonderful benefits on the books, but when the culture says, don't take that benefit, don't do this, you won't be considered a serious worker, we're really not supporting workers and being able to be flexible and adaptable and to do the different jobs that they need to do. So when we're doing telework and when we're thinking and considering telework, we have to be aware of these biases that come into play.